Hiring managers. What is the most bizarre accomplishment someone has put on a resume? A candidate listed himself as president of the Oregon chapter of the Third Amendment Defense League. I told him that I didn't see many abuses of the Third Amendment, and he said, "Then you see how successful we are." I was impressed. Yes, he got the job. Story 2. My manager at a fast food place told me that someone put down that they got level 99 in Diablo 2 Hardcore. She asked me if this was impressive. I said yes. Story 3. Working at a job placement agency, I have seen every terrible resume ever. But my favorite resume of all had just one line in his skills summary. I am relatively good at most things. That's all I needed to know, kid. Story 4. I have playing the harmonica badly on my resume. It was a good icebreaker in interviews until I was actually asked to demonstrate by a future coworker. She handed me a 99 plastic toy harmonica and called in 3 more people to the room. I rocked it. Story 5. When applying to a startup in the Bay Area I was in no way qualified for, I casually mentioned how I was 5th grade class president, unopposed. Though they were generally recruiting only Ivy, near Ivy kids, I did get an initial callback, something a friend from a top-ranked university did not get when we both applied. Joke's on them, I was 5th grade vice president. Duck you, Brittany, your policies sucked. Story 6. Giving injections to birds, medicine, found it hilarious that they felt it necessary to clarify the injections were medicine, as opposed to say substances. Story 7. A guy that I work with, who had no experience with the job he was going for, was asked by my boss, "Why should I hire you instead of the other people who have come in here?" He replied, "Because I'm better than them." My boss walked away into another room and laughed his head off. That guy is one of the top 3 workers where I work. Story 8. Just a cashier. A guy with a resume came in asking for our manager who wasn't there. The dude handed me the resume and I asked if he was looking for part-time or full-time, yada yada. He left, and on his resume he included a list of vegetables he can cut, which is cool and all, but it's a pet store. Story 9. It may not count as this was clearly a joke application, but I had a girl turn in a resume which included things like hit a demon with own 2 hands. 6. Confirmed dragon hit to date. 2 more plausible but unconfirmed. Proficient with siege equipment. I called her in for an interview just to turn the joke on her head. That didn't work. She showed up in functional full plate with a crusader's tabard and another girl acting as her squire carrying a shield, lance, and broadsword. It was hilarious. The best part is, the job was for a security guard. Unfortunately, she didn't get it. We have a military or police service time requirement and the Order of Holy Fire dose not count. Story 10. I once took an application from a guy who, when asked if he was convicted of any felonies, wrote no in pen, circled it, underlined the circle, drew arrows to the underlined circle, and didn't finish the rest of the application. Story 11. I was interviewing someone for a position a few years ago, and his resume was nothing but famous people he had met. He got mad when I explained to him that shaking hands with John Kerry is not an accomplishment. Story 12. They volunteered at the Quidditch World Cup. Not a resume, but I also interviewed and hired a woman with Tourette syndrome. She barked when nervous, but as she did not having a swearing tick, I hired her to work for me at the Disney store. She was one of the hardest workers I ever had, despite the constant barking. Story 13. When my best friend was in school, her teacher had the class make BS resumes just so they would know how in the future. Unfortunately for her, when she actually was looking for a job later on, she accidentally sent out her BS resume to quite a few potential employers with paranormal investigator and first female astronaut as her skills achievements. They never called her. Story 14. Direct quote, champion of the rock, paper, scissor at university. Regarding the usefulness of this skill, he was applying for a technical development position and did not get the job. Story 15. I used to work in a movie rental store. This guy turned an application in and under previous occupation he put hired killer. So naturally, my manager had to interview him. He was a soldier who just got out of the army after doing 2 tours in Iraq. Pretty cool guy. A little jumpy though. Story 16. I heard on the radio just the other day that somebody put on their resume entertainment director at the Department of Justice under employment history, which when asked what that meant, he replied that he was in prison for X amount of years. Not so much an accomplishment, but felt relevant enough to share. Story 17. I interview quite frequently for technical jobs. One person wrote that he worked at Big Bomb Fireworks. The rest of the resume was capitalized normally. Another person handed in a resume with yes scrawled onto it already in pen. Maybe he thought that one of us would assume that HR put it there, except he handed it directly to us. It also didn't help that the scrawl looked like the chicken scratch of a psychopath. Story 18. I have had dudes show their certificate for completing court-mandated anger management class, like, "I'm glad you did that and you've come a long way, I'm sure, but I'd wait until you land the gig before bringing that stuff up." Story 19. The heading on his resume read, "Extremely dedicated," and had a couple bullet points beneath it. One of the bullet points read, "Hit hand at work real bad." Sewed it back up with needle and thread. Guy showed it to me after the interview, and the thread was still sticking out. Here he had hit his hand during a lunch break while attempting to open a can of off-brand ravioli without a can opener. Story 20. 22-year-old guy came into a hole-in-the-wall burrito joint I managed in Australia 2 years ago. I don't have the copy I made anymore, but he was fishing for openings and dropping off resumes at every store in the area, and after he presented himself well, I decided to leaf through it, despite the fact I wasn't hiring. Listed as his skills: second-year piano student, RSA certificate attained, ITSFC and SITSOSHA compliant, 2 years left on both certificates, can telepathically converse with dogs. The context: this guy rocked up in business casual, decent hair, clean-shaven, the works. I would have been surprised if he didn't secure a position that day, which it turns out he had, as I called him back 3 weeks down the line when we had an opening. I asked him about his exceptional skills and how they might have translated to working in a fast-paced QSR environment, and he laughed and said that he put it in there as a catch, as he felt the document was too dry and needed something to make him memorable, besides his qualifications making him a perfect candidate. So, clearly, it worked. I can count on one hand all the resumes I've seen worth remembering since then, and his would be the only positive one among them. Story 21. I am not a hiring manager, but I once listed, "Can use both hands at the same time" as one of my skills. The manager would later tell me that was why she hired me over the other applicants. Story 22. Had a truck driver come into work with his resume and a paper that was about a page long. On the paper, it told his story. He said that when he was 5, he choked on a lye pop. It said he was very sick but got better. This was proof that God wanted him to succeed, apparently. Story 23. I've been playing Papers, Please again, and am seriously considering putting my extensive experience with that game on my resume. Hundreds of hours of experience using a paperwork simulator to improve reading comprehension, time management, efficiency, customer relations, and ability to manage unforeseen complications and interruptions. Story 24. Someone put that he was a guild leader in WoW, and that he successfully leads several raids. When asked about it in a phone screen, he said this showed that he had leadership experience. Story 25. I did hiring at a call center for a few years and ran across a lot of ridiculous applications and interviews, probably because the company I worked for was located in a college city and almost exclusively hired out of halfway houses and jail work release programs for tax breaks. Call center work sucks, so due to turnover, I'd hire between 15-40 people a week. A few that come to mind: a silly acid head kid who proudly explained during his working interview that learning the scripts wasn't important. See, he'd always know how to talk to customers since he could read the thoughts they didn't know they had and comfort them like they were back in the womb. He didn't land the job for some reason, but "back to the womb" became a call floor joke for a long time. An applicant in his first and only interview proudly stating that he'd do whatever it takes, whatever, for his employers, followed by, "'Cause I ain't scared to go back to jail, got me." I think he was offering to hit for us. A resume from a self-described warrior, listing the applicant's many successful frontline battles, complete with like 50 pages of color printouts of him at different rallies, shouting at college students and clinic customers, pics of him throwing dye-covered doll parts at traffic. The top of the application had, "Will you fight for him?" scrawled at the top, and the rest was covered in tiny, scribbled Bible-ish quotes and little highlighted, obvious truths he wanted to make sure we read, but of course not one mention of prior work history or references. An applicant who prepped for the interview by getting drunk and printing a little typed statement that her drinking was a disability, making it discrimination to expect sobriety from her, and she'd sue if she didn't get and keep the job. Brought no resume, didn't fill out an application, didn't understand the interview was over, for about 20 very awkward minutes after fumbling her note out of her purse. Boss called the cops when she tried to drive off wasted. Cops stop her less than a block from the office, and it turns out her kid was in the back seat. A shockingly detailed 3-page cover letter that was a first-person account of childhood abuse, explaining why the applicant lost it on that bus driver last year. Apparently they had hit a bus driver a little at some point, and explaining that they needed a conflict-free work environment and reacted badly to authority. Since both factors come up in phone work, we decided to not risk any office shanking. A 19-year-old kid on work release from the county jail claiming he had an MD and degrees in engineering, philosophy, and law. One of the other interests he listed was advancing neuroscience. When we searched the county database online, we learned he was on probation for selling meth and surprise, giving false statements to the police. A work release kid who came in to ask for an application stole the receptionist's cell phone while she grabbed it on CCTV and then tried to sell it back to her while dropping off his application the following day. I could literally spend the rest of the day listing lunatic job applicants. I'm so glad I don't work in that capacity anymore. Story 26. One of my MBA classmates had written winner of the cutest baby competition when I was 2 years old. This in a resume going out to top-notch consultancies, investment banks, and MNCs. Unfortunately, the authorities removed it in their scrutiny. Story 27. I was hiring a temporary worker to cover for a few days in a bookshop I used to run. Everything in the store was labeled 3, 5s, or 7 with big stickers, and he just had to sit there and make change for 3 days. Very informal, very low pressure. The ad made that clear. I said people should stop in for an informal chat if they're interested. This kid rocks up in a fancy suit as I'm closing up shop and hands me a full-color resume printed on fancier paper than my university degree was. His resume was so nice I felt rude not reading it. He burned a hole in the side of my head as I scanned it. Latin words shoved in where they didn't make sense. He used indubitably at one point. It was pretty terrible despite the nice font and paper. I'm trying to find something to say to this kid who has put so much effort into a CV that is counterproductive, if anything. I get to skills, other. Maybe he's all right after all. Can solve a Rubik's cube in 35 seconds. I say, oh, Rubik's Cuber, eh? I've got one right here that I've been stuck on. Maybe give it a whirl while I read the rest of this? I know that one's probably crap and sticky, so I won't break out the stopwatch. He did not laugh. The kid panics, and I realize my mistake. Why would he lie about something so irrelevant? I look down and read the rest of his CV. A couple minutes pass. I glance back up and he's sweating and muttering. I finish his CV and find nothing else of note, really. Grades and a very long mission statement with too many unnecessary big words. I know Rubik's Cubes. It's clear this guy has no idea what he's doing. Give him an out, like, I know it's hard to do this stuff under pressure. You've probably done more in 20 seconds than I did in a week. Don't worry about finishing it, really. He doesn't even look up. So, what made you want to work here? Nothing. Really, it's fine. Don't worry about it. The shame on his face as he put it down was a pretty big downer. Needless to say, he didn't get the job. Why, though? Why would he lie about something so stupid on an otherwise incredibly dull CV and expect me to not pick up on it? Story 28. My boss used to tell a story that several years ago he got a nice resume from someone, and everything looked good until he found a sentence almost at the end. I'm a natural winner. Before I was even born, I won the race against my fellow spermatozoid brothers. Story 29. I can perform an impressive array of animal noises. My current boss specifically asked me about it when I interviewed. Clearly it was worth something. Story 30. Not a hiring manager, but I was the technical interviewer on behalf of a hiring manager. He put alchemy under other skills. I'm a nerd who works in it, manages both Linux and Windows environments. This was for a customer support position, where the candidate would have to be able to diagnose issues with an instrument that contains a computer running Windows. This is the basics of the interview. He is introduced to me as the it guy by the hiring manager. His response to introduction is a smirk and, I bet you don't use Linux much, do you? Turns out he uses Slackware, UHG. Here we go. I might be biased here, but that's because the only time I hear about Slackware is from kids pumped out by the local community college whose teachers have a long-standing record of misinformation cultivated through personal bias. Trying to get him to talk to me about how he would communicate a solution with a customer who is having issues with the instrument, and after over a minute of silence and/or odd facial and verbal tics, I offered him to walk someone through using Chmod since he was so Linux-focused. He responds that it's Chmod, not Chmod, asked about other skills that might relate to science, since this is a scientific instrument. He says he does alchemy, and I laughed. I was flogged by the hiring manager for laughing. I wish he was there to understand what it's like to hear someone deadpan serious answer alchemy to, what science skills do you have? He did put it on his resume. I thought it was one of those quirky humor things people have been starting to do since it was on the bottom of the resume. Turns out the guy was a big-time Full Metal Alchemist fan. I know that's anime, but I'm not familiar with it, and truly spends a good amount of time doing things he considers alchemy. On Chmod, regardless of how it's pronounced, having the GIF versus GIF argument in an interview is not a good idea. Overall, I felt bad for him because this was clearly his first real-world interview and no one taught him etiquette. Story 31. I was helping my boss go through resumes for a director of marketing position. One lady mailed a 4x6 picture of herself with her cell phone number on the back and a winky face. She was very pretty. Story 32. I work at a software company that attracts a fair amount of fanboy resumes. For a couple years, I led a QA team and was heavily involved in the hiring process. Some of the worst ones are written entirely as a character from a game, or spend an excessive amount of effort trying to show off in-game accomplishments. Wow, Armory links always make me facepalm. My favorite, however, was an application for a QA tester that was 6 pages of wall-to-wall text, in which he began with a skills section that included helping to organize an annual KKK rally in Alabama, experience handling explosives, experience handling substances. He then went into a multi-paragraph diatribe about why his experiences with the KKK were so important. He never explained the bullets about explosives and substances, but he really seemed to feel that his professional approach to racial purity would make him an excellent software tester. When hearing about this, people often say he had to be trolling. Perhaps, but those 6 pages read like someone who really thought they were being convincing. I also had one I've always liked that had an interests section that included movies, TV, and video games. Like we were gonna read it and say, holy crap guys, this guy likes movies. Story 33, not me, but friend. Someone came in and apparently put ducked Lara Croft. When he told that it does not count, he said no, not the actor, the one in the movie. He didn't get the job. Story 34. A friend who was a manager at Wendy's got an application from a high school kid. Under previous occupations, he had a job at a candy factory, putting products in boxes. He described it as fudge packer. She hired him. Story 35. Got a resume once that listed 18 different jobs over the past 3 years. I recommended that we interview him just to witness the train wreck in person. My associates saw otherwise. Story 36. Not a hiring manager, but I'm a biz major, so some of my friends used to ask me to look over their resumes. Some guy in my dorm tried to put that he won his middle school cup stacking competition. Story 37. Raid leader in a top 10 guild. Everyone in the office poked fun going through the applications, but having spent years in that game, I know the sort of pressures, intelligence, focus, and leadership you just can't get elsewhere. It wasn't the reason he was hired, but it got him an interview. Story 38. By far the best I have seen is a guy put 2-time winner of Poo of the Month on his list of accomplishments. I brought him in for an interview just to meet the person that would list this crap. He killed it in the interview and got the job. Story 39. The best guy resume actually put this under MISC. The man, the myth, the legend. The best resume from a lady listed that she was not pregnant and not planning to become pregnant. Story 40. Not exactly listed as an accomplishment, but I was the hiring manager for a pizza restaurant. While interviewing an applicant, I noticed he had checked the box for having committed a felony. So I asked what the felony was. He replies, "Oh, some of my friends and I hit a pizza delivery boy during a robbery, did not hire." Story 41. I just rode my bike from Canada to Colorado and decided to stick around for the winter. I went into a shop that promotes healthy living and just told them, "I rode my bike here from Canada, I need a job," and they said I could start the next day. Apparently, employers have a lot of respect for spur-of-the-moment, crazy hobo extracurriculars. I got the job and I've been offered about 3 others in the span of 3 days. I never expected that being a total vagrant for a month could earn you so much respect from potential employers. Story 42. I once got drunk with Gabriel Byrne, people like me. I called her back just to meet a person who found this information to be relevant. Turns out she was right, people do like her. She's been working for me for 16 months and is one of my favorite employees. Story 43. My so works at a staffing agency and always sends me the ridiculous resumes she receives quite often. There have been times where she has received emails simply stating, "You got any jobs for me?" with literally no name, no contact info, and no resume. To boot is the fact that most of the correspondence is emailed from their less than professional email addresses. Story 44. Not a hiring manager, but I made a funny mistake on my resume. When adding my wildlife rehabilitation experience, I accidentally put that I have handled fawns instead of handled fawns. I did not realize this until sending out my resume numerous times. I didn't hear back from any of them. They either thought I was an idiot or were intimidated. Story 45. My GF used to work in a restaurant. Once a young student came in with her CV, pretty standard stuff for the most part, listed under accomplishments she had. World Lego Champion, Division F. Story 46. Had one person that put their previous responsibilities were moping and hovering. Always wanted to meet that guy, but didn't want to bring the office's mood down. Story 47. Had one applicant list human compass under skills. When I asked about it, he claimed he could point to magnetic north after being blindfolded and spun in a circle. I'll be damned if he couldn't do it. Pretty freaky, really. We tested him in various places, wearing earplugs, pitch black rooms, etc. He was accurate to within about 5 degrees every time. Yes, I hired him. He had the skills, and honestly, who else would you want with you if you were lost in the woods or wanted to migrate south? Story 48. I interviewed a guy who said one of his interests was investing in new technology. When I asked him what he means by that, and to give a few examples, he said, "Well, you probably haven't heard of any of them because they're pretty small, but I actually haven't invested in anything." I guess he threw that in there since I work in finance, thinking nobody would ask about it. The funny thing is, He had a good chance of being hired before that. Then nobody trusted him. Story 49. Once received a resume from and interviewed a guy that was also a Colonel Sanders impersonator. Apparently, there's a handful of men around the country that seek to achieve his look, and KFC uses them interchangeably, mostly for events and in-store promotion. It's also apparently not a full-time gig, as the guy had every intention of continuing down that path in parallel with a career at my company. Nice, qualified guy, but we did not hire him. Story 50. I run a small crew of bricklayers, and for us, resumes aren't really a thing. Yet whenever I put an ad up looking for skilled bricklayers, I get resumes sent in to me. Most of these contain zero construction experience. I had a 20-year-old who claimed to have experience in R&D, event planning, Photoshop, and accounting. He also added that he was applying so he could get experience in day-to-day work ethic. It's going to be a long search. Story 58. We needed someone with Win2K8 admin knowledge, mid-level networking knowledge, and preferably some experience with projectors and commercial AV equipment. Database knowledge, a huge plus. Also put in the ad, the obligee office suite yammer. Applicant responded advising he'd never worked with Outlook, didn't know anything about Windows 2008. He'd worked previously as a supervisor for a trucking company, had no networking experience, liked to make YouTube videos, and then spent 3 pages telling us how he taught himself to fix toasters. Story 52. I was in charge of hiring interns at a previous job. We would get a lot of clueless young college students with horrible resumes, which were almost always weeded out. Somehow a girl with a 4-page resume that listed accomplishments beginning in the 7th grade made it through the screening process. Name went into the wrong pile. Apparently she came in 3rd in the 8th grade spelling bee. Story 53. Had a guy list get a girlfriend in his goals for his next quarter at college. This was for a campus hire. I would have given him an interview, but his GPA wasn't even close to the minimum, 3.4 at the time, so there was no way I could get him hired if he rocked the interview. Didn't want to get a poor guy's hopes up. Story 54. I once put on my resume that I knew 8 different languages. They brought it up in the interview and asked what languages. Java, ABAP, SQL, C++, C. I said only one of them had sound. It was for a programming position, so they legitimately cracked a smile. Probably wasn't a deal breaker, but I got the job. Story 55. I want to know if putting your high school or college clubs on a resume actually matters, or is that bullcrap they say to get you to join? Got it. Straight out of school, yes. Neat. Story 56. This one guy had on his resume that he was a baton-twirling champion. We had to hire him just because we knew once he settled in that we'd ask him for a demo. He did it one night when we were working overtime, adding in a cartwheel. Best hire ever. Story 57. Oh, I've seen some bad ones. My favorite was a resume that had an accomplishment list of bullet points about a page long. In the middle said, canoeing, he thought both of those were necessary. Story 58. South Coast Pleasure himself champion. He later returned and asked for it back, telling me his brother put it on there. Unlucky for him, because we were looking for pleasure champions. Story 59. I knew someone who put divorced on his resume. His logic was that people would assume he was ready and available to travel or relocate. Edit, because I can't spell. Story 60. There was one resume that included this. I stayed at this job for 6 months, even after 2 of my coworkers were brutally hit while at work. Yes, that was listed on his resume. Story 61. I had a new grad with a degree in accounting who was in fact applying for a staff accounting job, put under the accomplishments section, once slept for 20 straight hours. I should have interviewed that guy. Story 62. My dad once had someone who put alchemy on his CV, as in turning metal into gold alchemy. He was a full legit senior mechanical engineer too. Story 63. I put on mine that I helped choreograph/film a popular YouTube video. Thankfully, they didn't ask about it. It was a really crafty lightsaber fight, but it did get 152,000 views. Story 64. A friend of mine, when indicating on her resume that she enjoyed work which was intellectually stimulating, wrote, I enjoy being mentally challenged. Hiring managers of Reddit, what are some telltale signs that your candidate is making things up? Story 1. As someone who has hired many technicians in it positions, I'm amazed at how many people would fake highly technical knowledge. I remember I needed a telecom engineer with very specific knowledge of a very specific voice system. I was getting suspicious of this one candidate, so I started asking about the exact syntax of command line. And this guy was actually throwing out made-up commands. I was both fascinated and annoyed. Story 2. One woman I interviewed literally took a pause and read the answers to the questions straight off of Google. Online Skype interview. I noticed it because they were really weird pauses and Googled it myself and literally followed along like subtitles. Story 3. When you're doing a video interview and you can watch them try to Google stuff in the reflection of their glasses. Small props for being clever though. He was paraphrasing the question back to me as a way to use the voice assistant. Story 4. I work at an architecture firm, and I kid you not, a candidate attached one of our projects in her portfolio. Exactly same 3D rendering. It wasn't even listed on the company website. How she got it is still baffling. The hiring manager just played along, story 5. Maybe more of an answer about general competence, but in my observation, the smartest people are comfortable saying they don't know something or acknowledge limitations in their knowledge or experience. Naive or bluffing candidates want to project an air of knowing everything, which is implausible. Another signal is how eager they are to go into depth. I interview programmers and technical staff, so I like to ask them about the project they are most proud of. I listen carefully and ask a few questions about how they worked through some thorny tech aspects. I understand that software is a team effort, but the legitimate contributors are eager to talk about technical details of what they built. The ones who just attended meetings and rarely contributed much struggle to say anything of substance. That is quite telling in my view. Story 6. We had someone come in and interview for a call center position. Their resume claimed they had 3 years working in a call center in town. When she arrived, she was very lethargic and couldn't answer basic interview questions. When asked what she did at call center A, she literally just said call center rep. When asked to elaborate on her duties, she repeated the same thing. No details were given. She even claimed that she has never been asked such hard and detailed questions during a job interview before. We didn't make it past 3 very basic questions. We have concluded she lied about working at call center A, or at least she certainly didn't work anywhere near 3 years there. Story 7. I speak enough gringo Spanish to get by, and back in the day when I was a hiring manager, if anybody put fluent in Spanish on their resume, I'd walk into the interview room and introduce myself and start the interview in Spanish. The looks of panic from the kids who'd taken like 3 years of high school Spanish before college were priceless. Story 8. Having interviewed quite a few candidates, I've come to accept that many people will try to BS their way through something they have a dabbling knowledge in. That's all right. When I ask a direct question and the person is trying to work it out on the fly to come up with an answer that sounds correct, I get some great insight into their troubleshooting abilities. This only works if you know what it is you're talking about, though. If you've never heard of Ansible, please don't try to tell me what a great database application it is. At the end of the day, though, my favorite answer and the one most likely to get a candidate with limited experience onto the next phase is to just admit you don't know, but that you'll look it up, Google it, and be able to answer the question next time. Most recent candidate we hired did just that. I passed the question I'd asked them on to the next person to have time to do the interview, and they were asked again. They must have had the right answer this time because I'm training them now. Story 9. I had one guy who listed himself as XXX manager at Y company at Z location from 2007 to 2011. The thing is, that was my position and title and location. Story 10. At a job fair, I told people that we were doing a lot of work in the programming language Balrave and asked if they had any experience with it. A disappointingly high number talked about using it for classes in college and writing some side programs in it after they heard about it and so on. They must have felt silly later when they Googled it and discovered that there is no programming language. Balrave. I just made it up as a way to tell who was lying to me. One of my coworkers said she wasn't happy with the dishonest part of that, so we changed it to, do you have any experience with Balrave? About 3/4 of people said something to the effect that they'd never heard of it. Of those, most said something like, what's it like? I know C++ and Java pretty well, and I use Python all the time, so if it's like one of those, I could probably pick it up without too much trouble. About half of those were good enough on other points that they got phone interviews. Story 11. A common one I see a lot is work history that is grandiose and excessively overqualified, especially if it's difficult or impossible to verify. I am in a high immigration city and deal with lots of international candidates and have met a vast amount of people with titles like Executive Director of Worldwide Distribution or Senior Vice President of Global Operations from a company in Bulgaria or Cambodia or Dubai with no phone number or English website. The position descriptors and skills on these resumes usually look copy and pasted from a template. And additionally, these people often claim master or doctorate level educations that are equally difficult to verify. I've had more than one CFO interview for an entry-level position who had never seen a profit and loss statement before. Story 12. We had an interview candidate who said their Excel skills were 9.5 out of 10, and they knew how to do pivot tables. They literally started crying when we brought out a laptop for the skills test and asked them to make a pivot table out of sample data. Story 13. STAR questions, situation, task, action, result, are designed to root out people that don't have real experience. Or if they do have experience, the questions will expose their level of skill and work personality. If I ask, can you handle underperforming reps? You can bullcrap a vague answer easily. But if I say, Tell me about a time when you had to coach an underperforming rep. What was the scenario? What actions did you take? And what was the result? That's much harder to bullcrap your way through. If you're making things up, the only way to get through those questions is to be vague, which is why you will see vagueness as a big tell in most of these comments. Story 14. Well, I was testing a potential welder once. He showed up in shorts, muscle shirt, and flip-flops to do a weld test and interview. I turned him away citing safety concerns about his wardrobe and never rescheduled. Figured he was too dumb for me to deal with. Story 15. I once asked to a supposedly experienced front-end developer, "Can you code valid HTML?" Her reply was more than enough. "Yes, all my software is legal." Story 16. When you ask them about something on their resume and they use the term "we" in their answer without ever saying what she actually did. It says here that you increased market share by 15% on your last product. What did you do to contribute you that market share? Well, we increased training and did this and that and the other thing. My question was what you, as an individual contributor, did to increase your market share. Well, we worked as a team. But what did you do? Good interview answers discuss what the team did and what the individual contributed. If the individual can't articulate what they contributed, they likely contributed little to nothing. Likewise, if they take all the credit, then they are also likely full of crap. Story 17. My own view. 1. No examples, just vague conversation or talking points. 2. Avoids or can't answer follow-up questions. Multiple interviewers hear a different story and take away. I had one person tell me they lived and breathes operations, and another interviewer they never worked in operations before. Do you think we don't talk before making a decision? Story 18. I don't see a lot of things people are totally making up, but it's easy to spot when they are heavily embellishing work history. It's totally fine to have worked in a restaurant or retail store. I'm hiring for entry-level professional positions, so you expect that kind of work history. I'll take your app a lot more seriously if you focus on the customer service aspect of the job and don't try to make it sound like you, the cashier, were running the place. Story 19. Sketchy job history, or several jobs in a short time span. I had a woman once that had around 10 jobs over the last 2.5 years. She claimed to have a wealth of knowledge from all of these different opportunities to learn. She talked around most questions, and long story short, I found out that she and a friend would apply at companies as minorities and then quit and sue for discrimination. She had sued 8 of the 10. Bullet dodged. Story 20. I swear, there are trolls in this thread just trying to duck up our confidence. The candidate was sweating, which indicated that they were lying uncomfortably, so we turned them away on the spot. They used the pronoun "we" once, so we knew they didn't contribute anything to the team. They told stories. I mean, what can we do to make our actual experience and qualifications seem legitimate? Story 21. They ramble, and the answers make absolutely no sense. 2. They never answer the question asked. They talk about something they are comfortable with in the hope I don't notice that they didn't answer. 3. Give them an easy test, one that, if you knew your skill, you should pass easily and within 5 minutes. If it takes longer, you either lied on your resume or suck at what you say you are good at. Story 22. Telltale signs that the candidate is making stuff up makes for great stories, but it isn't what bothers me. What bothers me is that I am convinced that there are people that are great interviewers and poor interviewers. My boss hired a great interviewer. Months later, we escorted him out of the building because he was beyond worthless. I wish I knew how many rock stars we passed on because they sucked at interviewing. Story 23. Not a hiring manager, but I sit on hiring committees from time to time. My pet peeve and telltale sign that someone is full of bullcrap is when you ask them a question and they just redefine the question terms. Example. Q. What kind of metrics would you use to analyze the success or failure of a certain program? A. I feel like metrics are very important for analyzing the success of a certain program. Metrics are measurables that are then analyzed to see how well something is working. It's very important to insert your business here. Yeah, no crap. Now answer the question. I always mark these people harshly for these kinds of answers, until we get them all the time. Please, if you're being asked a question, do not redefine the question. That is not an answer. This worst part is that I then have to explain to everyone else on the hiring committee why that was a bad answer. Most just nod and say, wow, he knows that X is very important to Y. It's like, yeah, of course it is. We just asked the question. We wouldn't have asked it if it wasn't important. Story 24. I used to do phone interviews to screen candidates for higher-up recruiters. The jobs I screened for required proficiency in English. And for one of the jobs, this was really important because it could be potentially dangerous, and most of the people in the country were native English speakers. The proficiency was met if the interviewer could understand the questions and adequately respond. For one particular candidate, I had gotten through the basic questions that really only needed a yes or no, including a question about understanding the necessity of understanding English for the position. But as soon as I started asking more in-depth questions, he would give me very short, grammatically poor sentences that didn't elaborate in the way I had asked. I also started hearing a lot of background noise and soon heard people whispering responses to him. Based on the job history and past residences, I figured he didn't actually know English and that his family was frantically trying to Google what I asked and was trying to help him respond. I feel bad that he was likely an immigrant just doing his best to get any sort of entry-level position. But safety is safety, and if you can't understand warnings and emergency announcements in the predominant language of your workplace, you're more liable to get hurt. Story 25. I always just assume resumes are a fluffed-up ball of half-truths that they make themselves appear better and more competent, useful on. I usually like to see how long someone worked somewhere for. If they're rocking 6 jobs in a year, that's a sign this person might be off. But if they have longevity at wherever they work, that holds some weight, I would say. As for talking to them, it's just a matter of getting a read on them. Life isn't like a movie where everything you say or ask will prompt a witty response or a great 5-minute story. Life is filled with awkward pauses and ums. If they do have the gift of gab, that's great, but also means they can fudge things much easier because they know how to work with people verbally. So keep your guard up. Story 26. Man, I remember for an entry technician job, they made do all these IQ tests and then asked me how to rewire a ducking big calibration machine or scales or whatever it was. I forgot. Bro, I couldn't do it. Like, that's literally the job. I needed that job so I could learn. It was a ducking nightmare and was embarrassing. I was so unprepared and didn't realize that job interviews were that serious. What graduate knows how to actually do the job out of college, man? In college, we literally learn how to learn. And then these HR people come up with ducking impossible standards to live up to, have 3 years experience postgraduate as an entry-level job. Then they turn around and say, it's okay to apply for jobs even if you have no years experience. Then they wonder why people lie or highly inflate their abilities on their resume. Because people are getting desperate after searching for jobs for months to years to not even hear callback. Edit. I think I was wrong when I wrote this. I only have myself to blame. I should have been prepared for that interview. I understand now and have since actually learned how to interview properly. Still having trouble with applying and having a graduate resume though, so I'm still frustrated, but the point is to try and just improve and not take it too personally from now on. Story 27. At our software company, we first screened potential candidates through a phone call with technical recruiters. One applicant did exceptionally well on the phone interview, answering all questions with apparent ease, so we decided to interview in person. The in-person interview went shockingly horrible. The candidate was unable to answer even the most basic question. After a few attempts to simplify questions, I finally decided to ask him what was going on. Turns out we had interviewed his computer scientist's son on the phone, and he was simply hoping to skirt by the in-person interview with 20 years of experience in construction. Lost his job. I tried to hire his son, but he wasn't interested. Story 28. For phone or Skype interview, if they come back to a technical question they bombed earlier and answer it with a textbook, sometimes literally response, they've had time to look up the answer while the interview continued. A lot of industries has some easy softball questions that nobody with real experience should struggle with, even under stress. How many clustered indexes can you have on a table? Miss that one, but rattle off a perfect description of every known isolation level without drawing a breath. That's reading it out of a book, not experience. Story 29. I was the store manager for a Korean woman, and I ran her anime pop culture type store. The way she wanted me to conduct interviews was how they do them in a lot of Asian countries. Hire them for a day and see how they do. This is all well and good, and I prefer to watch people and see if they are good for the job, but this is America. And if you tell someone to come in for training, they think they got the job. So they would come in for their interview or training day, and I'd ask all the normal questions and add in what anime or gaming stuff do they like, to see if they are knowledgeable in the stuff they like, and if they are willing to learn about other stuff they haven't seen or played. A lot of the time I'd ask if they play any MMO type games, and if so, what is their favorite? And I had people telling me, yeah, I play WOW. I asked what's their favorite dungeon, and they go on making stuff up, or they would tell me about the Leroy Jenkins dungeon, which means they probably haven't played but have just watched that vid. There was one guy though that I thought was bullcrafting me, and I asked him what server he was on this time, to really see if he knew any of the servers. He said, Drendon, this is the server. I was a guild leader on, so I said, oh, I've heard of that server. What guild were you part of? I might know it, he said. It was one of the biggest on the server. So I played dumb and threw out a few small name guilds to see if he was telling the truth or not, and he said no to all of them. I said, my guild's name, and he said, yeah, that's the one. I asked what his screen name was, and he told me. I actually remembered him from when I was the guild leader. So I said, "Hey, do you know if Hey?" He goes, "Yeah, that was the leader. Why?" I said, "You're ducking hired, but I'm pissed that you ignored me every time I asked if you wanted to join raid night." This will be proof that you can listen to my directions for once. Off topic, but this question reminded me of this story. Story 30, trying to turn questions into a conversation without answering them with any actual content. Example stories aren't compelling or don't flow naturally. Story 31, I once interviewed someone who said they spoke English. When it was time for the interview, she only spoke Russian. I happened to have someone who spoke Russian and English, so they translated the entire interview. Have some solid answered, so I hired her anyway. She worked for us for 4 years, and by the time she left, she knew English. Story 32. So I was sitting next to my boyfriend while he was giving a phone interview, and the guy was clearly Googling answers. He would ask him to repeat almost every question, then pause before a textbook answer. And at one point, he asked him to spell the word, but after knowing the spelling, knew the exact definition. Story 33. My brother was brought in to consult with a couple managers on a panel interview for an architect role. The interviewee ended up lying a few times on her experience on the interview, which my brother pointed out. The manager said he'd talked to her about it. She admitted to the lying, so the manager thought that somehow made up for it. My brother protested to leadership, and they decided to have a larger panel interview with a VP present to give her another chance. She lied again. She admitted it during the interview. They hired her anyway. My brother actually lodged a complaint with HR for it, since it seemed like she was held above other candidates because she was Indian and leadership was Indian. Nothing happened. Story 34. Not a hiring manager, but I covered my boss for an interview for whatever reason he had. The guy I interviewed had a degree in math, and the field I work in needs close to 0% of what you learn in a mathematics degree. I would know because I have a degree in math. I interviewed for the job because I had networking connections tied to the field, but I was super confused as to how someone else like me landed at the same place as me. So I asked him about it. Turns out that asking basic questions about a field you actually know about is very revealing. What was your favorite subject in math? Oh, I really liked calculus. Well, calculus is very broad. What specifically did you like? Something in analysis? While visually scrambling. Yeah, I meant analysis. Complex analysis, real analysis, functional analysis. Oh, well, I mainly focused on applied math, so I didn't really take those classes. You wouldn't take real analysis in an applied math track? That sounds odd. I had a bunch of interesting questions I wanted to ask him, but I decided to cut almost every question I prepared out the window. Also, if you put some bullcrap, I know how to code in X language, when you know damn well that you're not going to need it in the field you applied, you better be sure you can answer basic questions about it. Story 35. Whenever I interview people, I always ask offhand questions, with warning right before I ask, i.e., I want to pick your ability to think here, it's okay if you don't know. The point is to see if there's any thought process in the event of equipment failure. I work in biotech. Some will admit lack of knowledge, and that's perfectly okay and expected. Some others who really don't know will still try to fluff, so I start to get more technical. If they continue, they're out. Story 36. I got my current position through an apprenticeship. The thing was 6 months into the 18-month apprenticeship, it became obvious I could do the job role entirely by myself, but my manager was a bit hesitant to allow this for reasons known only to him. 12 months in, we had a situation, serious illness in one of my mentors, whereby I had to fly solo and just do the job. This turned into me doing the job full-time for the final 6 months. Came to interview for a full-time position against some very strong, highly qualified candidates in our field. I babbled and babbled until the very end of the interview when I said, "Am I allowed to say I've been doing the job for the past 6 months?" with glowing feedback. My manager laughed. One of my mentors simply said, "I would if I were you." Going on for 6 years in the job now. Very glad I said it. Story 37. If they try to downplay a task that you know is actually difficult. For example, I worked at a hotel, and whenever we had people apply to be housekeepers and claim to have experience, but when you tell them how many rooms they would have to clean a day, they would go 17. I could do 20-25 easy, but never ask how big the rooms were. Just basic stuff where they talk a big game and overplay their hand. Story 38. I hire people for a fast food job all the time, so it really doesn't have many requirements. It's quite interesting when at the interview, some people will add all these other places they have worked in. Of course, they don't have contact numbers on any of them, especially when you ask a customer service related question. Something along the lines of, "A customer received the wrong pizza and is calling us unhappy about it. How do you handle the situation?" When they've worked half a dozen fast food jobs but stumble over it super hard, it's suspicious. I don't even care if they don't know or if they have work experience, but if they seem disorganized or appear to be straight up lying, I won't hire them. Story 39. Most of the people in my industry work for one or two big players based on their geography at some point in their career. I get people that claim to work for X company all the time, especially in the early 2000s. Issue for them was a project manager for a decade and did most of the hiring. I love to ask them about their experiences working there, throwing out names or projects and seeing how they respond. The commitment to the charade is amazing. Story 40. I interviewed one person recently that has had 7 different contracts in the past 4 years with 7 different employers. She told us flat out that everyone that she works for offers her permanent work. She has been looking for permanent work, but yet she is so liked by these places and never gets it. I know they all have hired permanent people since, and even have positions open. But the big sign is that she did not list any of them as a reference. If they loved her and could not find her work, they would be surely happy to find her work elsewhere. Story 41. Nothing. Good ones can fake anything. I've found behavioral questions. What did you do when you were in situation X? Questions work better than technical ones because experiences are way harder to make up than technical facts. It's way easier to spot BS with behavioral questions. Also, we usually do a lab tour and a lunch with candidates that are off the record, but there's always an understanding that it's not a formal scored interview, but it's still a lab tour and lunch with a current employee or two. Hitting on one, let alone both, of my engineers over lunch is a DQ. Asking during the lab tour what our internet policy is, because at my current job, I'm so good that I get my work done in less than an hour a day and want to be able to slack off the rest of the time, is a very quick DQ. Both actually happened to my candidates I was helping interview or trying to hire. Story 42. I've been running kitchens for a long time, and anytime I get an interview who's talking like Gordon Ramsay or postulating about how good they are and how inspired by Michelin-starred chefs they are, it's a massive red flag that this idiot's cooking experience has been 90% YouTube videos, 8% home cooking, and 2% standing around looking at his phone on the line. Raging passion for the food industry is carved into you, and it shows in your people's skills, cooking skills, and work ethic. It doesn't come from calling your coworkers idiots and pretending you know better than your head chef. Story 43. I've found that if I give people enough rope, they will either hang themselves or tie a beautiful knot. I leave a lot of negative space in the conversation, and people tend to fill it because they want the interview to go smoothly. It's what they fill it with that lets you know about them. If I am not an expert in this specific job, I try to have someone sit in that is. I have had interviews where I had an SME sit in, and when the interview was over, I thought the candidate was good, and the SME tells me that they are completely full of crap. Some people are pleasant people, they just don't have the technical knowledge. So it's good to have someone smarter than them in the room. Story 44. We've had mostly great candidates, but if you're reading this thread and looking for a few tips, don't guess. Know what you don't know. Get comfortable with that. Be honest. Sometimes a big part of tech interviews is evaluating the candidates through process. So when you say, I don't know, you create an opportunity for the interviewer to ask you to try to figure it out. They want to see how you think, if you stay relaxed, whether you're collaborative, and so on. By lying or guessing, you remove that opportunity. If you're nervous and the thing that you really are supposed to know has slipped your mind, just say that. Generally, I will work with a candidate to help prime their memory and get the thing from a different direction. But I can't do that if I don't know that they've forgotten and are nervous. Lying is a huge red flag in an interview. It is a bigger red flag than not knowing a particular answer. So rule number 1 is absolutely don't make things up or try to fake it, because that is worse than not knowing. Hope that helps someone. Most people are great in interviews. There are a few fun stories here, but those are most likely edge cases. Story 45. Anyone who works in a tech role. Seriously, our recruiters will bring in anyone who checks off enough boxes under our required skills. They are easily fooled. Trying to fool the person who works with these systems on a daily basis ain't gonna happen though. It's easy to tell who's been there before. It's even easier to spot someone who is confused by completing a basic task. Also, important for the college kids, when companies hire for a junior entry-level roles, they fully expect most of the applicants to have slim to no experience. I personally look for kids who are motivated and have the problem-solving mindset. There are intangible things that will tell me if you'll be good at learning the job or not. So don't panic if you don't click most of the boxes on the application. Story 46. I've done some hiring, and I like to ask, is there anything in the job description that you have doubts about being able to perform? The person I picked had some questions about QuickBooks. Honest answer, and it was a very minimal part of the job, so I moved on. One guy answered by telling me he had no doubts or questions at all about any aspect of the job. Unlikely but possible scenario. He's being honest and is overqualified. Moderately likely scenario, he didn't read the job description entirely and didn't know what to ask. Most likely scenario, he's full of crap and is just feeding me what I want to hear. Story 47. I was a co-manager and I organized the interviews while the other co-manager gave the interview. I brought a candidate to the office and left him with the co-manager for the interview. 5 minutes later, I see the candidate walk out the door. I think to myself, what happened? The co-manager comes up to me and he says, "That was one for the books." I asked him what responsibilities he had at the most recent employer he had listed on his resume, UPS. He said, "I don't work at UPS." Then I asked him about a position he had a couple of years ago, and he said he never heard of the company that was listed on his resume. Finally, I just asked him if he made all of this up. He apologized, said yes, and got up and left. Story 48. Everything's just really vague. Results are never backed up by numbers. They can't describe exact actions they took. They use crepe loads of managers, jargon that often feels unrelated to the question. Story 49. I'm a college junior that's unsuccessfully interviewed for a couple internships so far. Any advice from people that have been successful other than just be yourself? Currently studying in the risk management and insurance industry. Story 50. We've had an astonishing number of people rate themselves a 9 or 10 in proficiency for PowerPoint. And then when asked what they used PowerPoint for at their previous job, they reply, something wild. Top answers have been emailing with staff, writing reports, organizing meetings with clients. Story 51. I was interviewing for a job doing some CAD work, and while I had CAD training, the interviewer pulled out some mechanical drawings and asked me to identify where items were on different views. He'd point out an item in view A and ask me to point out where that would be on view B. I guessed wrong 3 times. I felt like such an idiot. I wish I would have just extended my hand, thanked them for the chance, and walked out. That was 20-ish years ago, and I still get douche chills when I think about it. Story 52. At my company, they were doing an online interview to someone on India. When they started making him technical questions, they noticed the audio went out of sync. They paid closer attention and realized that in fact, he was not talking. He was trying to lip sync someone else, who was in the room with him, answering the question. They stopped the interview instantly. He wasn't hired, and neither was his more knowledgeable friend. Story 53. I was interviewing prospects for a video editor position quite a few years ago. I asked him if was an Avid editor. Avid is a video editing software. He said, and I'm not making this up, "Yes, very avid. I love to edit." Technically, he wasn't lying. Didn't get hired, though. Story 54. We had a gal that interviewed for a project coordinator position. On her resume, she's listed that she went to USC and got a degree in business administration. So I asked her if she liked the Marshall School of Business, and she replied that she did not go to the Marshall School of Business, that she went to USC. She had no idea that the USC Business School is called the Marshall School of Business. Story 55. Mainly, I would say as someone who hired people as manager, would be when they worked at a company for 1 to 3 months and all their resume shows is short-term employment. When you ask these people, it's always coworkers, didn't work hard enough, old boss was pushy. Or the best one I heard was that they were the one that worked too hard with no appreciation. Naturally, I would call the last place of business and almost always be told, this person came in high, never came in, or was a piss-poor workers all the time. Story 56. For non-entry-level positions, ask them about a failure related to their field of experience. What's the biggest mistake you've made working with X? Project, people, systems, etc. And how did you handle it? If they say they've never made a mistake, they're either not being honest or don't have much experience. Also helps find people that won't cover up their mistakes. If the candidate answers, they handled it by also informing their manager or executive team, they are usually more transparent and better communicators. Story 57. Not a hiring manager, but I realized I made a mistake during an interview. Mentioned a skill in a cover letter that I hadn't mentioned on the resume, so it made it look like I was making it up. I actually wasn't, even though it wasn't a skill I was an expert in, but I can see how not cross-checking cover letter and CV can quickly make you look like a liar. Story 58. I still don't think my hiring manager has it figured out. This is the cycle. Decent interview, get hired, work 1 shift, fail to exist ever again, go back to collecting unemployment, quite likely. Story 59. I once was interviewing a candidate for a design position who presented my work in his portfolio. That flagged everything else as made up and questionable. I grilled him on it for a few minutes before I was like, do you know whose work this is? I've never seen someone want to melt through the floor like that. Story 60. He was 30 years old, but claimed to have 25 years experience in the field. He claimed to have over 8 years experience with a programming language, which was only 4 years old. Story 61. I interviewed a woman who told me interviews were stupid, and her resume speaks for itself. She also told me that she would provide me references, but it's stupid to ask. Shockingly, she had terrible references. True shock, hiring managers of Reddit. What is the worst answer an interviewee has given you? Story 1. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Probably using my phone as a mirror. This was when the Nokia brick was the current cell phone. I would have hired him if I knew he could predict the future, but at the time that seemed stupid. Story 2. This one girl, interviewing for a six-figure senior project management role, indicated that she had problems with her previous boss. Sensing a possible red flag, I casually asked, "What was the nature of the problem?" And she said, "Basically, he wanted me to come into the office like every ducking day." While I was digesting this, she followed up with, "Would you want me to work every day too?" I said, "Well, the job is full-time, Monday to Friday, so yeah, I guess we would." She thankfully said, "Then I don't think this job is for me." I was looking around for the cameras. I was sure it was a practical joke, but it wasn't. Story 3. I was being interviewed for a retail job at Yankee Candle. He asked, "What's your favorite scent for a candle?" I said, "I prefer unscented candles." I didn't get the job. Story 4. I sat in on an interview. This is a career-type position, huge professional company. Everything goes well, and the last question, "So where would you like to see yourself in the future with this company?" "Oh no, I think this just sounds like a chill job for the summer." Story 5. After very vague and empty answers to the standard questions, the guy was clearly not making an effort. So I asked him, "Do you really want a job here?" He looked me straight in the eye and said, "No. My mom forced me to put in all these applications and answered the phone when you called, so I had to come in." Story 6. Do you mind taking a substances test? "Oh, I can tell you I'll pass." "Amazing, but I have to do it. Paperwork and all." Proceeds to discuss the best way to grow, treat, and smoke. "Yeah, well, I'll call you when I make my decision." Story 7. Interviewed a guy this week who showed up high AF and stank of booze. Knew he wasn't suitable for the position, based on the showing up high and booze scent part, but had to go through the interview motions for reasons of pleasantries. Asked him what his desired hourly wage was. He said, "Morning." Story 8. I'm a retail manager, and recently an applicant answered the standard, "Why do you want to work here?" with, "My girl is pregnant, and it's easier than McDonald's." When I asked him to elaborate on that, he said that while working at McDonald's, he was fired for sleeping while on the clock, and he knows he could get away with that at our store. Story 9. Myself. What can you tell me about interviewee? Hold on. They're talking about my boy on the tube right now. Work at a bar running the kitchen. This guy cut me off to watch Sports Center. Did not hire. Story 10. I'm not a hiring manager, but I totally blew an interview at a Danish company. The guy interviewing me had an accent that sounded just like Goldmember in Austin Powers. All I could think of was the line where he says, "Yes, I have a Dutch accent, and I'm Dutch. Isn't that weird?" I couldn't focus and could barely keep from laughing. I had no good answers for him and his 3 helpers. Story 11. We were hiring for an AIDS support position at a large organization. The entire interview panel is in suits, and every applicant up until now had been the same. The guy turns up in jeans and a hoodie. That might fly for smaller startups or whatever, but it's a huge strike against him here. Anyway, we get into the interview, and about halfway in, he takes his hoodie off, and he has this graphic t-shirt on with a big weed leaf on it. We had very strict questions we can and can't ask people in an interview, and no one knows what to do. So we go through the rest of the interview, but his shirt is this huge elephant in the room no one is acknowledging. We get to the end of the interview, and as we are about to send him off, my team lead blurts out, "Can you explain what your shirt is about?" He looks down at it and goes, "Oh, it's laundry day." Story 12. I was in the middle of an interview when one of the candidates pulled a book out of his backpack and just started reading it. It took me a second to shake off what he was doing. It was just so out of the blue. I got frustrated and asked him, "What the hell are you doing?" He just looks at me deadpan and asks, "If you're in a truck traveling at the speed of light, then you turn your lights on. Would anything happen?" I just said, "I don't know." And he stood up and said, "Fine, I don't want to work for you anyway," and walked out. I had no idea what the hell to say to my colleague, so we just went on with the day like nothing else. Never forgot it though. Story 13. Not a hiring manager, just HR. But there was an absolutely terrible interviewee. She came in fine and started out okay, but then I went to look at something on her CV and she went, "I'd like you to look at me when you're talking to me." Then, halfway through the interview, she said, "Yeah, I guess I've always been a quick learner." I jumped 2 years, graduating really quick, completely forgetting that she had actually written the dates of her graduation on her CV. Other than that, we just get the odd drunk high person in on an interview. I don't know why some people come in while under the influence of some substances, but there was one guy who told me he did it for the nerves. He was staggering when he showed up and kept losing the red thread while we were talking. Not sure if his nerves were calm, but his speech was nonsensical. Story 14. Best Buy interview. If you encounter a troublesome customer doubting your knowledge, how would you proceed to reassure them you're indeed knowledgeable about your product? What does troublesome mean? Yes, I understand, as you evidently do as well, that troublesome could in many different scenarios represent many situations not necessarily related to one another. However, this person just didn't know the word as a whole. He's also currently working. I'll say he's about decent, actually. Story 15. I received a job offer that I was certainly taking as I was preparing to go to a different interview, literally sitting in the parking lot to kill time. I went to the interview and he asked, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" as one of the first questions. Not really giving a crap, I said something like, tearing up some sweet, fresh Colorado powder on a weekly basis. I figured this was basically saying there's no way I intended to stay there long term because the company was on the East Coast. Turns out the interviewer was an avid skier, and we talked skiing for the next 15 minutes. Got that offer too. Story 16. Oh, I seriously have tons of these. How would you rate your conflict resolution skills? Oh, I'd say I get conflicts resolved pretty easily. I used to be a waitress, and that's why I seriously can't ducking stand people. What? Story 17. Me. Why do you want to leave your current position? Her. I don't like waitressing. The customers are annoying. I don't want to work nights or weekends. Me. This is retail, and our interview is over. Thank you for coming in. Former HR told me he was interviewing a girl for a management position. And when he asked what her management style was like, she replied, "I keep my game 100 all the time." White girl. Oh, I almost forgot the time that I was interviewing a girl and her boyfriend called the store and asked to speak to her. I asked him if it was an emergency, and he said, "Yeah, she said she had an interview there and I'm making sure that's where she really is." Girl seemed really nice, but nope. Story 18. Had a guy show up 15 minutes late for an interview. The department I was hiring for was desperate for help, so I asked him if I sat him for an interview if he could make me want to hire him. He said yes. During the interview, I asked why he was late. He said he couldn't get a ride from his ducking girlfriend. I asked him if that was a common problem. Yeah, she likes to smoke a lot and forgets when you ask her crap. I informed him that the interview was over and we were not going to be hiring him. He stands up and says, "I was late because of that, Karen. You can't hold that against me." Then he storms out, muttering various curses and slurs under his breath. Story 19. I once had a guy in his mid-30s, about 10 years of experience, software engineering. The first real question in our interview process is just having the candidate pick something they've done that they enjoyed, think is impressive, and tell us about it. So we ask him to do it, and he's like, meh. So I picked the most recent item on his resume, a job he's been at for 2 years. What do you do there? Oh, it's a job for a monkey. I basically just mediate between two teams. I'm not really sure why that's even a role. Okay, I guess that's why you're leaving. So what about this next one? Oh, that was truly Giddick. They just and on and on. In 10 years, he hasn't had a single role he deems worthwhile. And worse than that, he's doing a great job convincing us of that fact. Now, as an interviewer, what am I supposed to think? That you only land crap jobs because of some ancient Egyptian curse or something? We didn't end it there, just in case he was a hidden gem of technical skills. He wasn't. But that's easily the worst I've ever seen anyone do at that question. Story 20. Hiring an entry-level help desk position. Guy had a really good resume, so we invited him in for our standard help desk testing. It's a basic test that is used to gauge your skill level. The test wasn't used in determining your employment, just if we hired you where we would need to begin training for you. However, those that performed better on the skill test generally fared better since it was an IT-related position. Part of the test was to load some files on a thumb drive that we provided from a laptop. Very basic skills test. One guy fumbled through it for a few minutes and couldn't get the thumb drive to come up on the laptop. He unplugged it, rotated, and plugged it in over and over. Nothing he tried worked. After 5 minutes, I told him not to worry about it. I would retrieve the files later. His response was an exasperated, "I'm sorry, I could show you I know how to load files on a thumb drive if the laptop wasn't broken." To which I replied, "It isn't. You were plugging the thumb drive into the Ethernet port." To clarify, the Ethernet port was on the side of the laptop, so it's likely he was just flustered, though he did poorly on the rest as well. Also, we were not allowed to help candidates, even with simple things such as this. I wanted to tell him to examine the ports. However, HR told us our verbiage had to be verbatim between candidates. So if I informed him where the USB port was, I would need to inform all candidates. Story 21. I was a young retail manager. I'm in my 20s. I interviewed a woman in her 40s. I introduced me and shook her hand. "Who's your boss?" she started with. I replied, "I am the store manager." She says, "You're young enough to be my son." We hadn't even sat down yet. I also usually asked interviewees what superpower they would want if they could have any. One kid responded with, "Go invisible. It'd be nice to sneak around and watch people." Really weird answer, and raised some red flags in retail. Although one girl answered with, "To reach into my pocket and always have exact change." Best answer I ever heard. Story 22. I interview potential employees fairly frequently, but have little time for an interview, so when it goes south, it immediately over. 6 months ago, I was interviewing a candidate with my coworker that went so bad, we couldn't help but help ourselves by asking more questions to see how much worse it could get. He came impressively with a binder of awards to show us. He got each award at his previous company. In the end, we found out that each award was for the company/group completing a project, and it was the paper that came with a t-shirt to celebrate. Nothing he did personally. There are a few for perfect attendance for a month. Those also came with t-shirts. He repeatedly boasted throughout the interview saying, "I got a lot of t-shirts." I asked him what quality means to him. His response was, "Quality is like when your wife gets her face all made up and you're like, wow." I had to follow up with, "What is bad quality to you?" Answer, "That's like when your wife wakes up in the morning and you're like, ah." We asked if he could build things as we are a production company. He mentioned his Ferrari he built, kit car, from a Fiero, and how people would stop him once on the highway. Then he would ask repeatedly, "Want to see my Ferrari?" A lot. When I drove him back to the main building, I let him show me a picture of his Ferrari out of curiosity. It was a badly painted Fiero with what looked like red duct tape holding parts of a conversion kit, and it was freaking ugly and not passable. It took him 7 years on his account. For fun, I called his reference. He gave us of a guy that currently works at our company in another department. He said, "Oh, Pikachu? For duck's sake, don't hire that guy." We both laughed, and that was that. Almost wanted to hire the guy for daily entertainment, but that wouldn't have gone well. Story 23. Me. Why are you leaving your current position? Him. All of my coworkers are stupid. I hate being a manager. My direct report is so incompetent. I reported him to the CEO, but he hasn't gotten fired yet. This was for a supervisor position on a highly collaborative team. Story 24. Can you tell me about a time you went above and beyond for a customer? Well, the store was about to close, and this lady came up to me looking for a gift for a 3-year-old boy. But she didn't know what he liked or anything, and my shift was about to end, so I got Karen to help her instead. Story 25. I worked where HR had a stranglehold on the process of bringing in candidates. Often, they send ones with zero experience or aptitude for the position. One of the best examples. So tell me, what experience do you have that qualifies you for the Senior Healthcare Systems Analyst position? I worked at 7-Eleven. In IT? No, night shift at the one on Fremont Boulevard. Story 26. Is there anything that will prevent you from getting to work on time? I smoke medical marijuana for my back problems, so I could be late or may not be able to come in on some days. This was in a state where medical marijuana was illegal at that time. Story 27. Had a great one last week. Hiring for an entry-level tech support position. It's entry-level, so I don't expect the candidates to know much. But still, this guy is a recent grad from a technical program and lists pretty much every flavor of Windows in his IT skills. Okay, so I ask him what he feels is the best operating system for corporate desktop PCs. He looks at me like I've asked him for the recipe for Coca-Cola, stutters for a moment, and then informs me that he really loves the OS on his new iPhone 7. Yeah, it's way better than the old one. So this is probably his choice, the iPhone OS for desktop PCs. He did not get a second interview. Story 28. I'm not personally a hiring manager, but I have relevant story. A long time ago at an old job, we had a VP who was controversial for being generally incompetent and antisocial. Everyone's interactions with consisted of persistent low-level harassment, impossible to respect the guy. One day he is fired, much to everyone's surprise, since we figured that if he managed to stick around as long as he had, then he would never leave. We later heard about the last straw for the company president. The company was hiring for a market research type role, and this dullard VP always did the first round interviews. Second round, and a candidate is invited back on the VP's recommendation to the press. The president goes into the second interview with this candidate, supposedly vetted by the VP, and inches away from a job offer and asks the basic question of why he want to work for this company. Presumably, the VP asked this right off the bat the week before. Really, I just want to get bartending off my resume. Story 29. I wasn't the hiring manager, but the one getting interviewed by the owner. He set me up for failure. I had to drive out of town on my own expense to the interview. It was a tech sales position. The owner asked me if the company advertised 24/7 support, which I replied yes, but he told me I was wrong right away. It was on their homepage, and it was in the lobby of the office stating 24/7 support. Next question he asked me was to name 10 of his clients. His clients weren't publicly listed. When I told him that I couldn't name them, he told me I wasn't fit for the job because I didn't answer his questions correctly. So yeah, duck that guy. Story 30. This isn't quite an answer to an interview question, but I feel it's related. I tried to give an internship to someone in Washington, D.C. It was during a time when there was lots of ISIS chatter fear on television. I knew the girl from a friend, and she was qualified for the post. She just had to show up for her interview with myself and my superior to prove she was normal. At 3 a.m. the morning of the interview, she sent me a message saying that she was too afraid to get on the train to go to the interview because she thought ISIS was going to blow it up. 2 weeks later, she calls me asking if she could reschedule and if she could take me out to dinner to apologize. She didn't get the job. Story 31. Hire dispatchers for 911. We have a panel interview with 3 dispatchers, a supervisor, and the hiring manager. It's pretty standard to go back over a document that is required by state law called a personal history statement. You have to disclose all your criminal family employment history. One of the questions asks when you last used marijuana. His answer in his PHS was around 5 years ago. Fine, don't care. His answer to the panel was something along the lines of, I was real nervous about this interview, so I smoked one up in the car before I came in. Everyone turns to look at me like, WFT? He didn't get the job. And yes, I know everyone uses weed, and yes, I'm all on board for legalizing it. However, it is pretty poor decision-making to smoke out right before an interview at a police department. I wouldn't do a few shots right before the interview. Story 32. Not a hiring manager, but I discussed that with the one on my company. This guy came to interview for a job as a software developer. According to his resume, he had a master's in computer science. It came to simple test, and the guy didn't know the modulus operator. Really, dude? Story 33. I served as hiring manager for one round of hires for a retail store. My applicant base was half teenagers looking for a first job, and half elderly women retired from professional careers. One of the teenagers had a helicopter mom who literally did the entire application process for him. Me and the other assistant manager were naive and gave him an interview. He had zero idea what was even on the application that had his name on it. His mom also tried to sit in on the interview with him. Parents, don't do this. If your kid is getting a real job, this is when it's time for them to start adulting and for you to start giving them some autonomy. For the older folks, we had a lady of about 60 come in who was an absolute terror. She was demanding a salary for a wage slave position. Her available hours were barely non-existent between her constant doctor's appointments and taking care of her son. Her only son was 25 and in college in another state by her own admission. She was the epitome of the I want to work when I feel like it type. Story 34. Technical question with a short, exact answer. What is the difference between override and overload? Long, drawn-out, wondering response that doesn't really answer my question and further makes me regret asking you any questions, which, as an interviewer, gets us going in a really bad direction of, I really want this interview over, aka, it's okay to say, I don't know. In fact, I have questions designed to get you to say, I don't know, because I need a person who knows when to ask for help. Coding isn't easy. Specs can be drawn up wrong or incomplete, and we all make mistakes and don't know everything. It isn't a trap. Say, I don't know if you don't know. Story 35. I used to work at a factory, and I was hiring 10 employees for a new line that was opening up. One application stood out. Have you ever been convicted of a crime? Yes, see other side. The other side of the application was the part where you listed out your employment information. There, under his last employer, he listed his reason for leaving as restraining order. Supervisor disrespected me. I was pretty convinced he was screwing around, and we had open interviews coming up anyway, so I just called him and told him to show up to those. I've never seen such an angry person in my life. The entire time he was there, he was clenching his fists and jaw. Everything irritated this guy. He explained he was mad about parking, and the line to get in, and the waiting area, and the way some other applicant looked at him. I think I could have handled a smartass trying to be funny on an application, as unprofessional as that is, but this guy was a ticking time bomb. Story 36. Not a hiring manager, just an administrator, but I used to be involved in recruitment for the care company I work for. We generally do competency-based interviews, so the questions roughly boil down to, do you have an ounce of common sense? And one of the questions is, if a client refused their medication, what would you do? The correct answers are dispose of it and inform the office, or call the office and ask what I should do. We asked one woman this, who had been working in care homes for a good decade or so, and her answer was, well, at the care home I used to work at, we'd crush it up and hide it in their food. Noped the duck out of that interview and reported the care home to the safeguarding board. There are almost no situations where it's legal to force someone to take medication, and there are certainly none where a carer would be allowed. Story 37. My sister had an interview at a restaurant. The manager asked her what she does when she gets slammed. She thought he meant slammed as in drunk and trying to look responsible, said, I walk home. He meant slammed as in busy. My sister was humiliated and also rightly did not get the job. Story 38. Not myself, but my boss interviewed someone. He asked them what their last job was. I worked at for 3 weeks. Oh, that's interesting. Why such a short time? Expecting to hear how terrible it was. They're known for being terribad to their employees. Oh, and I got fired in training because I didn't meet performance standards. Story 39. Once I was interviewing someone for a network admin position. He listed on his resume about 10 years of network admin/architect experience at a Fortune 500 company and talked up his networking knowledge throughout the interview, although he was being very vague, which I assumed could be due to NDAs or the like. One of the standard questions I would ask in interviews for this position is for the interviewee to describe how ping works. I have gotten answers that ranged From the incredibly basic, it sends a message to another machine to determine if it is reachable, to much more in-depth answers explaining how the packet is routed, the specific byte order of an ICMP packet, how it's encapsulated/decapsulated through the stack. This guy's answer was simple and straightforward. What is ping? Is that a new feature on Windows 7? I've never heard of it. Story 40. Last year, I worked on a junior enterprise, and one of the questions we made to new candidates was something on the ballpark of, tell us one time you took responsibility even though it was not your job. The guy legit started talking about his parents' divorce, how he felt it was his fault, and started crying on the interview. I was lucky there was also a psychologist doing the interview with me, otherwise I would have no idea what to do at all. Story 41. After a little back and forth to get to know each other, I asked this question, which usually tells me whether or not the person should be considered. What specifically about XYZ company and this position caused you to apply? The worst answer, which I'd say I get 60 to 70% of the time, is something along the lines of, the salaries on Glassdoor are really nice and I want to make good money. There is no coming back from an answer like that. It tells me the candidate did no research on the company or position, and that they have no career goals outside of making money, like, no crap, you want a good salary, everyone does. That is a default assumption for when you apply. I'm looking for an answer that tells me you won't simply be a warm body in a chair. Story 42. I'm not a hiring manager, but I'm a supervisor that sits in on interviews. The worst answer ever came when my boss asked the question, where do you see yourself in 1 year with this company? Her answer was, honestly, I won't be here. This is just a stepping stone, so I can get a real job. Yeah, we didn't hire her. Story 43. Why did you leave your last job? I was fired. Oh, how come? I said I wanted to go to university next year. And did you go to university? Yes, I got my HND in mechanical engineering so I could apply for jobs in places like this. Oh, that's nice. I didn't get the job because I said I got fired from my last job. I thought it was a pretty good reason though, but apparently not. Story 44. I worked at a small business, a pottery painting place. I wasn't the manager, but I sat in on an interview once. This one chick came in late wearing a Rocky Rococo's uniform. We asked if she worked there and she said, not anymore. I just ducking quit because my manager is, I'm a hole, and he assaulted me. I ducking hated it there. This was basically the first question we asked. The whole interview, she went on to just completely trash talk her old manager and old job, the people, everything. Really bad idea to trash talk other places of work that bad when trying to get hired by another. And for the record, this chick seemed definitely crazy, and I really question if what she said about her old manager was true. Story 45. In the interview for my current job, I mentioned that at my internship, one of my duties was testing the viscosity of paints, basically how thick the liquid is. The interviewer asked, when you measured viscosity, did you use instruments? I was a few hours into multiple rounds of interviews at that point, so I couldn't stop myself from sarcastically replying, no, I just ran my fingers through it. Story 46. I was hiring a software developer. Asked some questions about the specific tech we were using, stuff that was listed on his resume. He got nothing right. Gave him a basic programming question to whiteboard. I don't actually care if this is functional code, it just gives me a chance to see how someone plans out code and if they know some basics, like loops and variables. He said, man, don't make me do this during the interview. You know I'm going to be working on a team. They'll help me get this. No, mother ducker. This is a small shop. The team will be you, me, and one other person. I'm not going to screw myself so you can get a job you're not qualified for. Story 47. I had a Skype interview for a hands-on grad program in film. My Wi-Fi sucks. So during the formalities, the audio was cutting out, and I was so nervous I didn't bring it up and just nodded and said, that's interesting. Gets to an actual question and audio cuts out, I ask him to repeat twice, but he didn't hear me, so the idiot in me says, well, I've royally ducked this one up, haven't I? Expecting the interviewer to be unable to hear me, he heard it all. Luckily, he laughed, told me I was doing fine, and continued the interview. I did end up getting a place on the program to my amazement. Story 48. It's not an answer I was given, but an answer I gave. When I was very young and very unemployed, I was interviewing, and they gave me that standard, why do you want to work here question. I answered, I'm not picky, which to me made perfect sense. What I meant was I was looking for work, and I'm willing to work anywhere. They thought it was hilarious. Luckily, they were hiring a lot of people, 100 plus, and I was told much later on that they were sorting resumes and came to mine and just didn't know what to do with me. So they hired me almost as a joke. Story 49. I know the hours are 9 to 5, but can I work 12 to 1 so that I can carry on my volunteering job? The truth is, I don't want a job. I just have to come to these so I can get my benefits. When asked by the job center why I didn't hire the guy, I was honest, told the advisor that this guy had no intention of working. I ended up having to give a statement to someone high up, and he lost his benefits as it was the third or fourth time they'd heard this, but I was the only one willing to give a statement. Story 50. My mother once interviewed a guy for a university job, and when she asked him what historical figure he most admires, and he said Hitler, the guy wasn't even white, and it's unclear if it's just that he was uneducated or like he was trying to be interesting, but he did not get the job, obviously. Story 51. I had a candidate come in that claimed responsibility for leading a project that I did at a prior company. I shelled him with questions for about 10 minutes about it when he finally asked, "How do you know so much about it?" I smiled and responded because I was the person who actually led it. Story 52. One of my friends decided to include on her CV that she was an avid runner and had ran the London Marathon. The problem was that she had never ran any long distance in her life. She went for an interview for an area manager role at a large supermarket chain, and the interview happened to have a high interest in running. He asked her what training she did and what time she achieved. She panicked and said not much, and just over an hour. She rang me afterwards. I couldn't stop laughing. Safe to say she didn't get the job. Story 53. Why did you leave the last restaurant? They weren't down with my summer schedule. She had over 8 weekends she couldn't work due to summer music festivals. But I got them back. They got a visit from the health department the next day. Story 54. I had one person basically just rail their old job for about 5 minutes during an interview. We cut the interview pretty short because there wasn't a chance we were hiring this person. Story 55. While in college, I applied for a part-time gig at a local ice cream shop franchise. The interview was with the shop's manager, and it went fine until she asked, "How would your friends describe you?" I don't why, but that one stumped me. I could see her expression start to change negatively as I stammered a bit, so I just said the first thing that came to mind, obnoxious and opinionated. She was pretty floored, as was I. I somehow still got the job, though. Story 56. My son is one of those people. During an interview I arranged for him with a friend, he was asked about the importance of customer service. He proceeded to lecture the interviewer on the importance of management to treat employees properly, so that they, in turn, would treat the customers right. He obviously didn't get the job. Story 57. I don't even remember the question, but the answer was, I don't really like that question. Can you ask me a different one, please? There was about 20 cc of really awkward silence afterwards when we just stared at each other, neither of us blinking. Then she burped really, really loud and kept staring at me like nothing happened. Didn't even acknowledge the burp. I just asked another question. I didn't even know how to react. Story 58. I sat in on an interview with a very attractive female coworker. During the interview, this very disheveled, overweight man introduces himself and says to my coworker, "You know, you look like my favorite star, Alexis Texas." During the rest of the cringe-worthy interview, he kept saying, "Wow," and staring everywhere, but her eyes. Needless to say, he did not get the job. Story 59. On the form. Name, date, hobbies. Why do you believe you are suitable for this role? Story 60. Not a hiring manager, but a couple years ago, I tried to apply to Target. Walked in, met one of the managers who happened to be black. He told me his name, but I forgot it almost instantly. When I tried to get his attention, I called him Tyrone. I got the email rejecting my application the next day. Story 61. Me. So what made you interested in coming to work here? Her. I don't really care about the job. I just want to move to New York City. I was actually like a 6'10" on her. Recommended her for a follow-up interview because outside of that one answer, her resume was pretty decent and she was good on the technical portion, but apparently she flamed out in the second round interview with my director. Story 62. Tell me about one thing you're passionate about. Roller skating. When was the last time you went skating? About 3 years ago? This tells me the person doesn't really have something they're passionate about, or they're not proactive enough to go out and do stuff. This question was not the deal breaker, but combined with other answers, gave a clear view that the person would not be a proactive employee. Story 63. Not me, but a coworker. So what can you tell us about your experience in field? In a condescending voice. Well, as I mentioned previously, it was sort of relevant, but not really thing. Looks back over notes. No, you actually haven't mentioned that yet. Even then, that's not quite what we're looking for. Out of everyone interviewed, he was the only one to not make it to the reference check stage. Story 64. Not as funny or scandalous as a lot in this thread, but this one just bugged the hell out of me. Can you pass a substances test? Sure. Applicant left our office to get his substances test, which he badly failed. If he'd been honest, I probably would have let him come back in a week. Why lie and make us pay for a test that you have zero chance in passing? Story 65. To a prospective employee who reeked of booze. Do you, have a drinking problem? Oh no, I can kill at least 2 six-packs without throwing up. Story 66. I noticed you were unemployed for 5 years about 10 years ago. What's the story? I was in prison for insurance fraud. Sort of ended the interview right there. Story 67. People, please stop posting emails. Here's the basics of the rule for the lazy. Posting or seeking any identifying personal information, real or fake, will result in a ban without a prior warning. This includes for yourself or other people, and refers to, but is not limited to, Names, phone numbers, email addresses, Facebook, or other social media accounts. Story 68. After clearly not knowing what the job entailed, I asked if he had checked about the role, knowing it was my number in the advert to call to ask these questions. I didn't know was able to ask about the job. That's why we have Call Me for information on the position. Oh, I wondered about that. Story 69. Not an interview, but application questions. A teenage girl came in with her mom and dropped it off. Why do you want to work here? Because my mom wants a discount. Are you legally entitled to work in Canada? I don't know, but I'm willing to learn. Story 70. When I asked which of a list of things with many metrics associated with them were likely the most important to the client, he picked the first two. The list was alphabetical. I asked him why those two, and he couldn't come up with a single reason. Story 71. A few years back, my employer was looking to hire someone to handle data processing. Lots of Excel, Google Docs, that sort of thing. The first 5 or so people that came in to a test couldn't even figure out how to open Google Drive to locate the test material. Story 72. Someone was interviewing with me for a retail position at a used video game store. She let me know that she is really good about not stealing money out of the cash register, especially if there are security cameras in the building. I just assumed she was good at not stealing money until she explicitly mentioned it in the interview. Story 73. Years ago, I had to sit in on an interview. They got asked, describe a situation where something went wrong and how you fixed it. The purpose of the question is to determine if they have the initiative and troubleshooting skills. Their first response, it wasn't my fault. Story 74. Ooh, I worked for an IT company, hosting data centers, etc. I was hiring for sales. He said, I know company does the internet. I use the internet sometimes. This was 2 years ago. The guy was about 30. Also, he then tried to get me sacked when I didn't invite him back for a second interview. Nice dude. Story 75. These threads always make me so ducking sad and angry about the people that get called in for interviews and I can't even get a call back. Hiring managers, please take notes. Story 76. Worked for a media company in a niche market. When we asked this woman what her favorite shows were, she talked our ears off about our major competitors' IPs, not one of ours. Then asked if it was against dress code to wear cat ears at the office. Story 77. Interviewing for a permitting technician position. Sort of secretary-ish, but a little more technical. We were curious to see who actually knew the name of the building we were in and who read the job description. So the question was, how would you answer the phone? The worst answer was, hello. Story 78. What would you do in case of ammonia leak? Well, I'd tell everyone in the building to leave and then I'd get the duck out. Oh, shoot, sorry for my Congratulations, you got the job. Story 79. Interviewing a guy for a barista position. The interview went really well, until I asked why he had left his last job of 2+ years. And his response was, they were always trying to tell me what to do and when to show up and stuff. It was just a bunch of micromanaging bullcrap. Story 80. I sometimes steal things. Not too much, just little things like candy or a couple dollars. I asked them to tell me a strong point and a weakness. Story 81. This was actually a fellow manager's interview for a decently senior role queue. What would you expect to get paid? Money. Not a word of a lie, this is our race. Story 82. My husband interviewed a girl who used to work at a pretzel place in the mall. Similar to Auntie Anne's hot pretzels, he asked what some of her job requirements were, expecting to hear money handling or customer service. Mix, twist, and bake. Story 83. I was a mid-level manager sitting in on an interview that was being conducted by my boss. Do you have any hobbies or special interests? Candidate. Nude gardening. Story 84. At the initial, and in this case final, interview. Will this take long? My boss doesn't know I'm here, and I'm supposed to be making a delivery. She had parked a big-ass panel truck blocking 3 handicapped spots. Story 85. Not a manager, but we hire graduates regularly, and this one interviewee started telling us how he's been psychoanalyzed and is one step away from being a psychopath. Story 86. On a resume under other skills, ability to problem effectively, literal understanding of how things should work. I almost called them for an interview just out of curiosity. Story 87. My favorite was while interviewing someone for a security analyst position, me. Can you tell me the difference between static and dynamic reverse engineering? Her. Static, like on the TV? Story 88. In answer to the question, what would you say are your main strengths? He said, I'm reasonably observant. We asked if he wanted to expand on that at all, and he said no. Story 89. Look, man, I'm like Tony Montana. You only have 2 things in this world, your word and your balls. This was the first talk for a pretty formal white-collar position. Story 90. So what do you know about our company? You do stuff with car tools or something? Can you be a bit more specific? No, I really don't care about cars. Hiring managers have read it. What makes you immediately throw out a resume? Story 1. I used to do a lot of hiring, It's disheartening to read so many comments about immediately eliminating overqualified candidates. Not all overqualified are just filling time and looking to jump ship ASAP. Many want to try something new, something less demanding, something that helps move them into a different role or field. It's a serious mistake to eliminate overqualified candidates without even talking with them. Story 2. I remember a meme or maybe a TV skit from a while back. The hiring manager had a huge pile of resumes on his desk. Someone asked how he was going to sift through them all. He took 2/3 of the pile, threw them in the trash, and remarked, "I don't hire unlucky people." Story 3. On a more lightweight tone than most of the other comments, I once received an application from a man in 60s. Solid CV, lots of experience. In his covering letter, he wrote, "I'm applying because the job center asked me to. Please note that I intend to retire in 6 months' time." We had a good laugh, then sent him a very polite rejection letter and wished him a great retirement. Story 4. The only time I've ever had to throw out a resume was because someone possibly had it in a bag with their lunch and the paper was soaking wet and dissolving as I tried to unfold it. It was just unacceptable to process. The application was left in a Dropbox, so I don't know if it was a prank or an actual applicant. Story 5. So, all of this should carry a caveat that every industry, employer, and manager is different. You get the full spectrum if you scroll through all the comments. I work for a small company in the education field, so proceed with that knowledge. Aside from the obvious of not meeting required, not just preferred qualifications, I really try to give a lot of grace. Not too long ago, I was slinging resumes left and right, and I know what it's like trying to put your whole life on a piece of paper. I don't mind things like some small spelling errors, simplistic formatting, not having a lot of experience, or just having long breaks because you had other things going on in your life. All of that is fine within reason because I don't expect you to commission a linguistic and graphic design team to vet your resume. That being said, put your education at the top, followed by any field-relevant awards and extraordinary experiences/opportunities that commend your excellence. Like you won a competitive scholarship, got to intern at NASA, whatever. Then immediately follow that with your experience. If you have to pad your resume with extras, put it near the end, because by then, if I'm still reading it, means I'm already interested in you. If you have absolutely no experience, that's not something you can change without someone in my position giving you a chance. We know this. Tell me the strongest qualities you possess that would make you a good fit, and give strong examples that you would respect if the roles were reversed. As to the actual question, things that make me throw resumes away. 1. Serious and consistent grammar mistakes. Not just I misspelled a word or two, or English is not my first language, but anything that suggests that you might be lying about the degree you say you have. The way you write is the only exposure I have to you that can help me gauge how put together you are. So it's weightier than you think. If you know you aren't a strong writer, keep it simple, direct, and professional. That at least tells me that you're in control of what you say in front of a client. 2. Complete lack of effort. If you're agonizing over Times New Roman, Calibri, or Helvetica, you're likely already putting enough effort into the content of what you're saying. Whatever the stock font of the word processor you're using is, it'll do. Just choose a scannable format with enough spacing for me to easily find the sections I want to spend time on. On the other hand, if you're wondering if you really need a third sentence in the entire resume when your first two were absolute bangers, that's where you need to put more effort in. 3. Doesn't meet what I've listed as absolutely required, non-negotiable, essential skills. Don't be afraid to send in your resume if you have 8 months experience and we say you need a year, or if I prefer someone with X degree. But don't be upset if I say I need a 4-year degree and you apply with an associate's. It's often rules that are made by policy that I'm bound by just as much as you. Extra tip for interviews. In addition to having looked at the company website and knowing just a couple things about us, show up to the interview with a spare copy of your resume, just in case. Anything humanly capable of going wrong on your end is equally capable of going wrong for us. Showing up with a just-in-case copy tells me you're prepared, and also means you can super casually direct my attention where you want to point something out. Story 6. It's been a long time, but I used to do hiring for a cinema. Staff were often young. For many, it was a first job, making popcorn and selling tickets type of gig. I would not pursue anything where parents came in with a CV for their teenager, or if parents were contacting me on behalf of their teen. Big red flag. Either their kid didn't want the job in the first place, or they're incapable of taking initiative, and it doesn't bode well for how they'd be as an employee. Story 7. Back in '98, I asked a new group of hires at Geico to write their email addresses on a list that was passed around. Remember, email was kinda new back then. One young female employee's email address included my bald pussy. Story 8. In 2012, I got a resume for a potential intern that I will never forget. I received a pack of about 80 resumes for intern candidates from a certain university. One resume stood out. The entire resume was My Little Pony themed. There were MLP pictures plastered all over. There was a bar graph of skill proficiency and things like friendship and caring were listed. The candidate had a picture of himself with MLP characters photoshopped in around him. The worst part was that a lot of the verbiage had cringy baby babble such as "wyke" instead of like, "We didn't call that guy in for an interview." Story 9. I'll usually still interview unless there is no relevant experience, but I've seen some atrocious resumes. I've seen people use crutch words like in writing for a job description. I've also seen a sentence 4 lines long with 0 punctuation. The same resume will have attention to detail as a skill set. I've interviewed for one of those resumes and the applicant said, "I don't know," to about 80% of my questions, and it turned out he didn't even know what job he applied for. It's not that I'm overly picky, but if someone can't spend the 20 minutes or less that it takes to proofread their resume, are they going to put a lot of effort into their job? Maybe, but it's hard to know. Story 10. Typos, especially with homophones, which don't usually get flagged by Microsoft Word. I'd love to be forgiving with the English language because it's hard to be perfect even for native speakers. However, I hire for library positions. When librarians catalog materials, switched letters or numbers may lose a book in the system entirely. Mixing up homophones may mean a patron can't find the book they need. Librarians proofread manual catalog categories to catch errors and then catch more errors in practice. Po body's nerfect and all. But the resume shows me how a person pays attention to these details at their very best with all the time they could possibly need. If there are mistakes, and that's their absolute best, it's probably not a fit. That said, if I can excuse an error in a cover letter, I will. Cover letters are annoying and time-consuming to write. Story 11. Reading through this thread, I see why people lie on resumes and have someone write their resume for them. Even in federal hiring, selecting "I'm an expert in this subject" in all fields of the suitability questions is the only way your application gets past the filter. Story 12. When they just copy and paste a whole phrase from the company website. I have to hire cafe cashiers regularly and have read too many resumes saying how they are good at creating exceptional dining experiences, driving profitability for our franchises, and leading the industry through innovative concepts and proven strategies. I would prefer someone who says, "I'm punctual, I live close to the store, and can carry heavy stuff." Story 13. I tossed lots of resumes that were many pages long. Some of these were from people who had been in the workforce for decades and had listed every job from 1985 now. But some of these were from kids who had 2 part-time jobs and wrote 20 or 30 bullet points detailing their tasks. One page is clean and concise. Someone who is reviewing 30-50 resumes probably won't want to read more than that. Somebody's telling kiddos nowadays that it's a good idea to put a picture of yourself on the resume. I saw several this most recent time and have never seen anything like it before, so I assume it's misguided advice. In my opinion, this is not a good idea. It seems odd and somewhat unprofessional. I also tossed resumes that had a template or form that wasn't filled out properly. Cover letters were fully optional for this position, but I still received a handful, and every single one was filled in for the incorrect job. I received a cover letter with absolutely none of the information filled out at all except the girl's name and phone number. I don't mind if you use the world's most generic template, but at least put in a little effort to fill it out.